We're live.
We're live. All right, live and indirect. Perfect. Good morning. Good morning,
Morning.
man. How are you?
Great. I'm well. I'm ready to do this.
Okay, ready to do it.
Ah,
Perfect. Perfect.
yes.
Um, well, moving right along, however slowly. I hope folks will forgive our slow reading of chapter 25, which is the last chapter of the book. Only now beginning discussion of the third section. Matt, we haven't had a discussion about chapter 25. Chapter 25, and what I mean is, at least logistically, of course, we're talking about the contents of the chapter. We ought to talk about how the chapter is divided, and then the final section of the chapter is a corresponding empirical evidence. I've read just very briefly about the last section of chapter 25, and it's corresponding empirical evidence to substantiate the claims, the explanations that are provided in the things that we are reading at the moment. And it makes me think about a couple things. It makes me think about, first off, the saliency, the pertinence, the relevance, and the importance, really, of the last part of the book, which is the part on primitive accumulation. In fact, it's the part with which we began to do the reading. And it's the part, at least for me, the first time that I read it, really gave me the point of reference to make sense of the more abstract and even convoluted, at least initially anyway, aspects of chapter 1 and aspects of chapter 2. Anyway, point being is that this last section really helps to crystallize and concretize my understanding, and I see how it will do so. And so at some point, we ought to think about how it is we're going to, offline, of course, we'll think about how it is we're going to discuss this last section. But be that as it may, at least as far as our logistics are concerned for the discussion that we've been having now, about a year. Amazing, isn't it? About a year. If we can set that aside for the moment, Matt, how are things generally and briefly, of course, in the literary world, in the world of poetry, in the world of letters, as far as
Recently I was actually part of a anthology that got that was put together by a collective called Cutthroat, which has all kinds of people from all kinds of places. So it was a pretty big project, pretty sweeping, and it was reviewed in the LA Review of Books, and the LA Review of Books singled out my contribution to the anthology in
Wow.
their review. And so, intrepid young man that I am, I found the author, I found a way to communicate with him, and I sent them a copy of my book.
Ah.
So hopefully they'll review my book in the totality of it. So.
Well, those are the methods, means, systems, all right, of making things happen.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
kind of like what people should really understand is that that these things that happen that are very cool and exciting are not trophies to put on your mantle. They're actually tools to help you climb mountains.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wonder just if we can stray from the very basic theme of our work, just for 2 or 3 seconds, Matt. Just for 2 or 3 seconds. It'd be very interesting for you to, or maybe it already exists. I don't know. Maybe it exists and I simply haven't caught it. Do you provide a forum for discussion as far as the strategies, not just of putting words to paper, as it were, but putting that paper or those books in the market of ideas, in the market of words. Do you talk about that? In other words, that kind
Yeah,
of.
I have in the past. I was charging some money to do professional development classes, and I may do that again. But I always have problems doing that. I much prefer to sell my speeches or my workshops to institutions because I have
Uh,
no problem taking money from institutions because I'm just counting
yeah,
here on these
yeah,
giant, on these giant interests. Whereas from an individual person, taking $200 from them always makes me feel bad. Like I feel like I'm taking money from their family
yeah,
budget or something.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I much prefer. I have no qualms taking like $2,000 from say Cal State,
yeah,
Dominguez Hills, but I have a real problem taking like $50 from
yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely, absolutely.
an
Yeah,
individual person.
I
So
understand.
yeah, I do. I do.
All right. Well, we'll keep our ears open for that, our eyes peeled for that, and we'll see what we can do to get the word out. Okay, perfect. Well, back to the task at hand, which is a discussion of Section 3 of Chapter 25. Chapter 25 being the general law of capitalist accumulation, and Section 3 being the progressive production of a relative surplus population or industrial reserve army. What I'd like to do is I'd like to divide our discussion this morning in two parts, and I'd like to present a short review of the first part, and then such that we engage in a discussion about it, and then follow that with a short review of the second part, where we repeat the discussion. Anyway, so here goes. Here goes. Drawn as it is from my notes. In this case, the case of this particular section, the qualitative transition about which Marx writes, and that represents the change in epoch, is characterized by a quicker rate of accumulation, because, as Marx writes, mere accumulation, the absolute increase of the total social capital, is accompanied by the centralization of the individual capitals of which that total is made up. And this, he adds a bit later, goes hand in hand with a similar change in the technological composition of the original capital. What the change in technological composition means as constant capital, in other words, that part of capital represented by the means of production, by the raw material, auxiliary material, and the instruments of labor, replaces variable capital, in other words, labor power, is that the demand for labor falls progressively with the increase of the total capital. In fact, Marx adds, at an accelerated rate as this magnitude increases, right? So that this displacement isn't set, this displacement, right, figured as it is on technological advance, figured as it is on the centralization of capital, happens at an accelerated rate as the magnitude of accumulation increases. So it's exponential. It's exponential. The logical consequence is therefore the production of a relatively, and this in quotes, a relatively redundant population of laborers whose count is greater than what is necessary for the average needs of the self-expansion of capital, and are therefore who Marx identifies as a surplus population, a kind of a dystopian, dismal, heartbreaking read of history. Matt, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, well, definitely in the time Karl Marx is writing about beggars in the East End. He's writing about people who are proletariat,
Yeah.
but cannot sell their labor power, and they're put in this position where they must sell their labor power. They must sell their ability to work. They must work, but they cannot. Um, and you know, this is happening in a period of capital when when these massive industries are popping up and they don't know how many laborers are needed and how much this then. And so this is, I don't know how deep into the industrial revolution this would have been, but this is still very much a feature of the relationship between the capitalists and proletariat at the time he's writing.
Yeah.
As things in the United States of America, when you see the expansion of industry, when when the industrial revolution kind of comes to these shores, it's a rapid expansion. It's not only that it's these industrial jobs, these factories opening up. It's actually whole new cities being built, a whole new, not being reformed, but just being built. So, like cities like Chicago,
Yeah. Yeah.
rise up, and with them a mass influx of European migration, of the European importation. In fact, much of what would be described as the American industrial proletariat, the United States, was actually an imported proletariat. Many people, when we think about groups of people that come into this country via Ellis Island and end up settling all throughout the country, they are really kind of an imported industrial proletariat. It's, the people that made up of previous to that were kind of still like farming and this and that, the other. I mean, so many waves and waves and waves of proletariat came in, and it wasn't just like the country boy leaving the farm to the big city. And that happened,
Yeah.
but a lot of what happened in this country was the importation of industrial proletariat. So and mixing with the expansion of these giant cities. So yes, you had slums. Yes, you had these things. Yes, you had these horrible experiences that people needing to find work and not being able to find work. Yes, you had experiences of certain European ethnicities told they need not apply in certain areas and certain times. But for the most part, what you saw was the expansion and the enfranchisement of people into political machines, into this, into that, and the exclusion of other populations, but the largely the enfranchisement of the industrial proletariat as the cities grew up, because there wasn't really this thing of like, oh, there's just too many people, not enough work. That really was not a feature here in the United States. It wasn't until later, with a lot of different technological developments that we're seeing worldwide, that this kind of question of what Marx is describing really makes sense here in the United States, and really makes sense all across the world, and makes more sense today than
Yeah.
with the time when he wrote it. I mean, it made sense when he wrote it. It wasn't like it wasn't fabricating anything. I mean, it was a phenomenon that happened. But what we're looking at different is that what he's describing is cyclical. There's a new technology comes to town. No one knows how exactly to adapt to it. People lose jobs. People don't have the skills for that kind of thing, and they need to be trained up. And so we need to have some type of education system that actually trains them to use these new machines, which are much more highly productive, like Bessemer steel, for instance.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing that he's describing. But what we see today are machines that really do not require human labor. It's not that they require a new set of human labor; they require no human labor in order to
Yeah.
produce things. And so how that plays out in different places, what that looks like in different places takes on different forms. I mean, so like in, let's say, the country of Japan, where there's a very, very high level of automation, you don't see what we see in the United States, which is like massive homelessness and um, uh, the this explosion of the prison population, etc. You don't see that in Japan. What you do see in Japan is the country with the world's highest temporary work rate. You see people killing themselves. You see, explosive increase. You see kind of general not all these people not knowing who they are, and they're expressing it so
Yeah.
culturally with all the young men who can't find work. And you see that among at certain age brackets that The majority of the time you're expected to work a job is something like 3 to 6 months. So you're not expected to have like 7 or 8 careers over your time. You're expected to have like 20 or something like that. So like you see that the turnover rate in Japan because of these things is just an incredible. It's an incredible rapid cliff. But there is a greater social safety net in Japan, and there is a less brutal prison system in place in Japan. So you don't see what you see here in the United States, which is just complete, you can't work, and so you're subject to murder and mayhem, and you're subjected to this like very tiered society, depending upon
It's
which,
it's interesting to know the experiences of for the life of me, I don't remember the particular source, the particular citation, though I remember the conversation that I had with a professor years back. Mauricio Monceau, I think his name was. He was a professor at USC. He wrote a very seminal book on the attack of Pachucos by, I guess they were called the Zoot Suit riots. The blame was put on the victims of the riots, and he wrote a book about that. Steve Monceau, I think his name was. In any case, I was in conversation with him, and he shared with me a quote, except he didn't identify in this particular quote, a little, it's relatively long quote. He purposefully left out the ethnic categories of the people in discussion, and also he purposefully left out the geographic context of this quote, so that he began by talking about, in this quote, talking about people who were imprisoned, the ways in which they were vilified preceding their imprisonment, and the profiteering that took place, and the justification and the rationale that led up to their imprisonment, and the smug sense of righteousness on the part of the imprisoners, on the part of the jailers, on the part of the system that imprisoned folks. And then he asked, who are we talking about here? Who is in discussion here? And well, I thought to myself, obviously he's talking about Chicanos and blacks in the state of California, Chicanos and blacks in the LA prison system. And he said, no, whom it is we're talking about here are Korean immigrants in Japan. So it's very interesting to take into consideration, and here, even in keeping with the general themes of our discussion, right? Or rather, how surplus populations, how redundant labor, if you will, how are they channeled in, and how are they mechanized to keep the systems of accumulation in place? I want to get back to something that you said a few moments ago, Matt, and I want to ask you about it. You made the phrase, as the cities grow, which I think is a very important phrase to take into consideration. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about, and in keeping with the discussion that we've had at the outset, I'd like you to talk a little bit about centralization, right? I'll remind, folks, that Marx wrote, see if I can find it from my notes here. Here it is. Marx wrote, the qualitative transition about which Marx writes, and that represents the change in epoch, is characterized by quicker rate of accumulation because, as he writes, mere accumulation, the absolute increase of the total social capital, is accompanied by the centralization of the individual capitals of which that total is made up. So as the city grows, and you identified Chicago, I think you identified a few other cities, right? And cities in the Midwest and cities on the East Coast. As the city grows, so does centralization in the geography. So does centralization, as it were, in space. And of course, I'm not talking about space up above, though that's a discussion for us to have in a few moments, I suppose, right? But centralization in space is taking place given the availability at that time of contemporaneous technology, and for that matter, given the limitations uh, of that centralization, of that accumulation, in at least as far as the United States is concerned, in mid to late 19th century. You want to talk about this tangible?
Sure. So we talk about this individual. What is an individual capital, right? So it says individual capitals, and
Yeah.
it's not the individual capital; it's the accumulation of the total capitals, etc. All right. So what is an individual capital? What are we talking about? We're talking about the ability to have to command the social power, to command people's time and energy, and a certain amount of people's time and energy around the central thing. It's not around your will. It's not around your individual charisma. It's
Yeah.
not around the speech. It's not around a general likability.
Mm.
It's around a certain physical thing that can like people can show up and do something. So it's a field, it's a factory, it's a this, and it's the ownership of that field and factory, and it is the human infrastructure that acknowledges the who owns this coal mine, right? And who doesn't, right? And that can command the forth people's time and energy. It makes people get up, wake up in the morning, do something. That is what an individual capital is. So last week we were discussing, what about the company towns?
Yeah.
And where you have one individual capitalist who owns the town, they own the general store, they own the schools, they own this, they own that, they own that. Now that is a very, very good way to make money coming and going, right? To make
Yeah.
money on the front end and back end, right?
Yeah.
So that's a really good way to do that. But that's impossible. There's to launch on an industrial scale. These were all like individual areas with one industry, and some general stores also owned by the company. Now you can't organize millions of people. You can't have a city like that. You cannot, because it would not be cost effective to educate every single person in the city. Um, that's not going to work, right? So when you have these cities growing and growing and growing, you have various capital interests, and the outsource of educating these people so that they may be exploited by private interests is actually given to the public. It's actually outsourced to the public themselves, so they will be educated using their own tax dollars. They will
Yeah.
be educated. The streets
Yeah.
will be paved
Yeah.
using their tax dollars. All these things will be paid using the actual the taxation of the proletariat.
Their own value.
Will pay for the preparation for their own exploitation.
Yeah.
And the conditions of the worker, the social life of the worker, were Marx prescribed as necessary labor, all of that. Well, the necessaries to live, the necessaries of life
Yeah.
shall be removed from them, shall be taken care of by the government using their money in order to better facilitate their exploitation. And
Wow.
that's what we live in. So under a company town, right, which we can see as grotesque and horrible, and it is, you see the company is actually providing, the tools. The company is providing the means. The company is providing this, and people go into debt to get these things, and that's horrible. It's a horrible, horrible system.
Yeah.
But the system we live under, which we think is good, is actually a system wherein we work for private interests, and we are taxed on our income from these places, goes to the government, and the things that don't go to war and don't go to just some horrible and don't go to some research and development so that some other capitalists can get rich, and things that don't go to those directions, which are obviously messed up. The things that we fight for, things we think are good, like education, like this, like sanitation, like freeways, like infrastructure, are all really there not just for the edification of the individual person, not for the edification of the community, not for the edification of a nation of, as we tend to call it, middle class or nation of workers. It's not
Yeah.
just there for that. It is there to ensure that you don't die in rotten filth, and that you know how to do basic mathematics and basic English, so that you can be exploited in a workplace environment. That is the city. That is the modern city that we live in, um, and and we're not aware of that.
You
We're not
know,
aware of that. We can point out how other things are messed up. We can point out, like, wait a minute, that's ridiculous. This is ridiculous. I mean, I've taken, for instance, to think about, like, this recent thing with Oprah and Margaret and Meghan Markle, right? So we can look at that, and we can look at that, and we can see the British monarchy as racist and horrible, and they certainly are. And someone could take the extension even further, to say, well, the British monarchy shouldn't exist. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that that they have these people that are kings and queens, right? Well, I would take it further that the wealth of Oprah should not exist. So then that's something that we naturalize. That, well, you know, fuck those monarchs, but Oprah earned her money. Well, you don't earn $1 billion. You don't. Nobody earns $1 billion. There is no earning $1 billion. That's due to the economic system that we live in. And certainly, there are much worse capitalists running around than Oprah. There are far worse, more exploitative, more environmentally destructive, more doing much worse things in the world than Oprah. So I don't want to make Oprah the scapegoat of billionaires.
yeah.
But she is a billionaire, and we live in an economic system that has billionaires and has people starving. And Oprah has played a pretty horrible psychological, been a class war criminal in that way. I mean, she given her own platform, talking, blaming people for the problems, and then also the people she made famous, like Dr. Phil, like Susie Orman, who basically comes on and tells people they can't afford to live their dreams. So like that's and it's their fault. And so that message of it's kind of your fault that you're in these messed up situations.
Well,
It is really kind of what that whole.
yeah.
Mhm.
What you're talking about then gives me an opportunity to get back to something else that you mentioned, which I think is
Yeah.
also very important for us to contemplate and to consider, is what then does it mean if someone like Oprah, and not just Oprah, as there are Oprahs, there are other people that are, that are functioning to advance the ideological interests of, our economic system. What is the role of such people in a society such that there are people who, as you say, do not know who they are, do not know, because they don't fit in this society, So what is interesting, because on the one hand, I suppose people turn to, I don't know if people are watching TV these days as much as they were, say, 15, 20 years ago, but people were turning on, a morning TV or afternoon TV to watch Oprah, in a sense, to find out who they were, to establish some kind of affinity and to locate themselves in society.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, the economic system that people like Oprah Winfrey are reproducing, and in particular, as far as her role at the ideological level is concerned, is doing the opposite of what people are intending to do as they turn in and channel in to Oprah Winfrey, right? They're
Yeah.
advancing
Well,
this
well,
erase.
specifically, Oprah Winfrey emerges out of daytime television, and daytime television is one of those brutal, just brutal human experiences anyone can go through. I mean, we're talking about shows, like the talk show, like Oprah Winfrey, like Sally Jesse Raphael, like Phil Donahue. I mean, that's specifically what she emerges out of, right? So these are people that basically come on, they act compassionate, and essentially tell you the reason your life is messed up is you. And that's what they do. And then it gets worse. I mean, it gets worse from there. Then you have the judge shows like Judge Judy,
Yeah,
Judge Wagner, Judge what's this guy, Judge Alex, then you get the divorce courts, and then you get
yeah,
the paternity courts, and then you get the soap operas.
yeah,
And all these things have the same kind of basic messages that essentially, like your world is in tatters and it is your fault, and that's the general message of society. But daytime television really actually, daytime television is actually a really, really big wing in that propaganda model, alongside with the entire self-help industry, right? Which again are frequent guests of daytime television. So the Tony Robbins of the world, you know, all these kinds of people, they're really there to convince you. This kind of the self-help industry. They're there to convince you that essentially, that today is the first day of the rest of your life, but you've been fucking up this entire time. And so that's what they're there for, and that's what that's their function in society. And so you have all these people who masses and masses of people who are being thrown out of work, masses and masses of people who don't know what they're going to do next. And that's why people facing these crises that did not begin with their poor decisions, crises that began with outside of themselves, being told essentially, get it together, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, sort of message. Like, I don't have any pity for anybody who doesn't, blah 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 blah. And so that ends up promoting this culture of blame yourself, blame
Yeah.
blame yourself. Now, I'm not suggesting that everyone should be like looking around and blaming quote unquote blaming others, because when people end up blaming others, what they end up doing is they blame the person they could see closest to them. Like, so the people that are responsible ultimately for the deprivations you experience in life, you're never going to meet. Like, you're never going to meet them. You're never going to see them. It's going to be difficult to even identify specifically who the people are that actually own, let's say, the banknote in your house, because that's all chopped up into like 1,000 pieces.
Yeah.
So you don't even know who you're paying your mortgage to, really. I mean, it says in your banknote, but the reality is that when that money gets to Wall Street, it's spread out across the world. So who really knows?
I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with a Jehovah's Witness that came knocking at my door. I don't know. I guess I was in the mood for a conversation, and these folks came to the door, and it was I wanted to ask them about the magazine that they were peddling at the door. And I said, well, initially you said you're going to donate, or rather you're going to, give me this magazine. And thank you, I'll take it, I said. But then you asked me for a donation for this magazine. And I said to them, where does this dollar end? Where does it go? And the folks said, and this I say, I'm not attacking Jehovah's Witness people per se. What I'm doing is I'm, giving an example, an illustration of what it is you're talking about, that we don't know where where the value of our work, where the money, where we have our investments, we don't know where it's circulating. Neither do we know who circulates it, who is really in charge of making those exchanges. And I asked these folks, and we proceeded to get into a conversation, and they told me that the money goes to the folks in charge of their church or the building where they congregate. And then I said, from there, where does it go? It goes to the bishops. And where do the bishops live? And they said, well, the money goes to folks in New York. And then I asked, where is this dollar deposited in New York? And very honestly, the folks said, we don't know. We don't know. And can you know? No, they said.
I'm surprised they knew that much.
Pardon?
I'm surprised they knew that much. That was a lot of information.
Yeah. But by the time it gets to New York, the people in charge of that organization, right, mm-hmm. are unknown to the people down at the bottom. So that there's all these filters that exist, and as you move up the hierarchy of filters, less and less people know who the people on top are. I'm reminded of the parallels that exist between this discussion that I've just shared, your discussion that you provided earlier, and the pyramid scheme, you know, where we don't know, we don't know who's on top, who's making use of, and who's engaged in the most fundamental exchanges of value that are taking place. Very
Yeah.
interesting. Very interesting. I want to switch gears just a little bit now and go to the second part um, as we continue. And it goes like this. It is ironic, perhaps. It is ironic, perhaps, that in labor's integration in the systems and history, the methods and modes, and the transitions of capitalist society, it is interesting. It is ironic, right? What is ironic is their inscription to the task of making themselves obsolete. In other words, where organized union labor is displaced, and here I'm using the example of union labor, but of course union labor is not the only form of organized labor. In other words, where organized union labor is displaced by outsourced and unorganized labor, where labor is compelled or otherwise tracked to outsourced or unorganized labor, and where outsourced and unorganized labor is displaced by machinery or by robotics, that fraction of organized union labor that finds itself jostling for greater proximity to capital is in fact functioning historically for the augmentation of superfluous and surplus population. This is a jab on my part at those folks that turn their back, right, to people in their communities, that turn their back to their co-workers, right, and but more so than just simply being a jab at their part, it's a recognition that, and it's an urging for folks to understand that these things take place within an economic system, right, that gives people, a pat on the back, if not a fatter paycheck for burning their community members. It's a kind of conspiracy that exists within a system. Your thoughts about this, Matt?
Yeah, no. I mean, conspiracy within the system. Yeah, no. This is what it. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to judge people when you take this far a step back. It's easy to judge people when you're interacting with them. And I'm not saying something wrong, but when you're in it, when you're eye to eye with them, it's very easy to be like, like you are just a lousy, like whatever, blah blah blah, because you're not acting with principles. You're just kind of you're out for yourself, and you're clearly willing to say anything and do anything to advance for yourself, right? And I hate you. How dare you? And people need to be better to each other. People do need to invest more in one another and less in these let's see lights outside of them. Right? But at the same time, when you start taking further and further steps back, when we start taking the lens of capital, the view of capital, you're looking at the larger picture, judging our individual interactions with how we treat each other, in this, as far as how we provide for ourselves, and our ethics, so to speak, with one another as we're trying to get a job and secure employment, and it's almost like judging the morality of lab rats. It really is. Just judging. I mean, I hate to be so grim about it, but that's what we've been reduced to.
Yeah.
So,
Well, we are
yeah,
commodities when we recognize that we are.
right. So you can look at the lab rats. You can look at the lab rats. You can look at them. You can look at them and say like, man, that rat is a real asshole to the rest of the rats, right? That's fucked up. That's wrong, right? And you may be right. You know, you may be right in comparison, right?
Yeah.
You may be absolutely correct that particular rat is showing very low character um, in its community. But this is what we've been. This is what we as workers are reduced to.
Yeah.
When we become proletariat, we are reduced to you know
Right.
it's a rats in a cage. I mean, we were reduced to just to do what we must to survive. You know, and we're not in situations where we have clear um, clear thought processes and clear means where we can actually be. We're not in a position. We're not put in a position to be decent to one another. We really aren't.
Yeah.
We're put in a position to fight for each other, to fight against each other, to be embattled with one another.
Yeah.
And under those conditions, we try to eke out some type of morality, some type of ethics. But I mean, I'm not saying not to judge people, and I'm not saying not to judge people by the standard, by them, deviating from the standards that, of basic decency that we've been able to establish, even given these conditions.
To smuggle into.
I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that from taking the bird's eye view higher and higher and higher and higher and higher and higher and higher to the point where now we're looking at like, we're talking about individual capitals. We're talking about the totality of capital. We're talking about, so now we're really far removed from the factory floor now, right? We have a further and further and further view. I don't mean we're detached. I just mean we have a further and further view. Like if your face is like this to a brick wall, you cannot see it. But as you back up further and further, oh, that's a brick. Okay, this is a brick wall. Okay, this is a brick wall. Okay, this is a fire station, right? You can see the further you get away from it, the better you can see it, right? So the further we get away from the day-to-day interactions and the day-to-day nonsense and the day-to-day fighting and the day-to-day just bullshit we put each other through, we can further and further see the conditions that set forth this horrible competition. And if we're gonna read Marx and talk about that, and then ask like, well, why are the workers so fucked up? Why are people so mean to each other? We have to really actually take that long view and say, okay, these are the conditions that we've been set. These are the conditions that have been set.
Yeah.
And that helps better explain that given these conditions, why these people made these decisions.
How's that for weekday morning TV?
Exactly.
How's that for weekday morning TV? How's that for self-help?
Nobody's getting a car, but
Absolutely. I was having a conversation recently about despotism, about vulgarity, about what's another fancy word that I might use at the moment? Banality, simplicity, mediocrity, right? With which that mediates so much of our existence, and that figures so often in the way that we interact with one another. And oftentimes, this petty behavior is, as you identify, as we read in Marx, as far as the historical and material conditions that generate culture, that these things, right, are a consequence. This behavior, seen this way when we step back, is a consequence of our confined existence, our contained existence in reduced spaces, literally in reduced spaces. So it explains why people are injuring one another when they live in cramped and confined, centralized spaces.
Yeah,
it will explain it.
Well, I mean, so prisons, right, are probably the best example of what you're describing, right?
Yeah.
Prisons, and prisons are, and I don't, sometimes people make these comparisons and metaphors of prisons, that maybe are inappropriate, because prison is prison, and we should really be honest about that. And like, prison's prison. Um, but at the same time, like there are other confined spaces, and they you do see a similar outcome.
Yeah.
You see similar outcomes from having these really confined spaces, in terms of people just being just not good to one another, just
Yeah.
not whatever. So what are some of these other confined spaces? I don't know. A classroom, a workplace,
Uh,
um, you know,
absolutely. Absolutely.
all kinds of things. I mean, some would say that a city is like an open air prison. Um, yeah, so you find these things where you or even the way the cities are laid out, especially in Los Angeles, how the cities are so fiercely patrolled, to not move one place to another. I mean, look at like it's kind of like I don't know, it's kind of like weird, like kind of border cities. Like if you look at like the border between, let's say, El Sereno and Pasadena. You look at the border
Oh yeah,
between Culver.
those streets are barricaded.
Yeah,
Literally, you can't make your way except through
yeah.
the major thoroughfares.
Right. So let's take another
Neighborhood
one.
streets are blocked.
Yeah, Culver City and Inglewood.
Yeah.
You know, to get it from Culver City to Inglewood, you gotta go through like the La Cienega, the streets. I mean, there's a lot of there's a number of examples. There's a number of examples. If you look at San Gabriel Valley, look at San Marino, how San Marino is located with like these little buffer cities in between. So it's like next to San Gabriel, to cut out Rosemead, to cut out like
Yeah.
there's like little buffer cities in between this like really rich center. So there's like a rich center, then there's like a less rich center, and then you start getting to like working class neighborhoods. But there's like the not quite
Core
the
wealth.
the not quite poor city sits in between the poor city and the rich city.
Yeah.
Um, and you see this time and time again all throughout the way Los Angeles is actually
Yeah, the
physically
10
laid out.
freeway, the 101, the 710, the 110, and the 405. I mean, they literally, right? They encapsulate what we call, well, now that it's getting gentrified, of course, we call it SOLA, right? But before, we used to call it South Central. Of course, between SOLA and South Central was South LA, right? But
Yeah.
certainly, right, we're talking about this, these confinements. Certainly, the 710 freeway being a barricade that contains the way that the city was laid out and the way that the freeway's been imposed upon the city. 710 and the 10 freeway and the 60 freeway, and then of course the 110 to the west contain this region that we call East LA or the general East LA area. Absolutely,
Did you know when they were going to
part.
when they the real estate interests, they were trying to rebrand Boyle Heights as Bogey.
Oh, really?
It was short lived, but I remember seeing that.
Okay. Hey, Matt, we're at the close. I didn't get into a discussion, or I didn't introduce the discussion about labor, production, and superfluity. And we didn't get into a discussion of the centralization of space, and not the centralization of space, that is horizontally before us, but the centralization of space that is vertically above us. We didn't get into that discussion, and maybe we can tap into that discussion.
They intend to gentrify the heavens. We'll get into that. We'll get into that soon. But no, I on that yeah. Okay, well, let me get the poem. Actually, I want to do this one instead. No, I'll do this one. I'll do that one next time when we talk about that.
All right.
But hey, the thing about the thing about let me pull this up very quick. The thing about the fact that we didn't get into the talking about the bringing of new machines, so we've talked about that so many times throughout.
Yeah, it's fine.
That's kind of a
yeah,
it's kind of a well traversed,
discussed.
at least with us here.
Yeah.
I don't think it's discussed quite nearly enough as it is actually taking place in the world.
Yeah.
So, but here we go. This poem is called Hammurabi. Let's see.
Can you tell us who Hammurabi was? That way, if there's any innuendo there, any.
Hammurabi was he was the king. He was a king of was he
Persia.
Sumerian or was he Babylonian?
I'm under the assumption the modern state of Iran. I
Right.
might be wrong. The modern state of Iran at one time was a
Was
kingdom.
it is Iran or Iraq at this point in time? I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly. I think it might have been both. But
Somebody
he
can.
was a king a long time ago, and he came up with the Code of Hammurabi, and it's a very interesting thing. I suggest people study it because he was Babylonian, and people really should study it because the reason I say they should study it is because if you look at it, it's not for some moral thing. It's really interesting. Like, what is the relationship between law and property? Because in actuality, a lot of the laws that he drafted in the Code of Hammurabi, it becomes very very clear that these things were already happening. It wasn't like he made a law and then all of a sudden now things were happening. It's that the law is actually human activity precedes the law, and then the law is created to govern human activity in the name, and almost all these things in the name of commerce. Because there's so many things that happen here that are really like they're things that are okay, good improvement, good rules of the road, whatever. But then there are other things that happen in there that are just so messed up. Like if a merchant comes in and the father's away and he makes a deal with like the idiot son, the merchant shall be killed. Like that, there's just like a bunch of yeah. There's a bunch of stuff like that. There's some horrible sex stuff. Like if you kill somebody's daughter, like they're entitled to kill your daughter. So like just really wild stuff. But it's all about property. It's all about property. It's all about and it's all taking back to that that the kind of that like local patriarch, the head of the household family
Yeah,
guy. Kind of like like in The Godfather. Excuse my idiot son. He talks when he should listen. So
yeah.
there's a lot of that kind of stuff in the Code of Hammurabi. So here's Hammurabi. I grew up on television, so do my parents. I love Lucy, lie to them sweetly. America's a redhead, desire suppressed in separate beds, censors rest assured, everything in good taste, everything in its proper place. Every traumatic episode ends with the threat of Ricky's hand never far from Lucy's face, beaming in glorious black and white, wrong and right, plot lines, shade out the gray, and John Wayne's shining silver city on hill of guns and butter, where every schoolchild's desk doubles as bomb shelter, praying to the ultimate in question. So, pledge your allegiance. Seal your documents and lock and load your freedom because it is not free. Now fall to your knees and praise be. It's the only God in which we trust, the atom, the Manhattan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, nuclear family, nuclear testing, nuclear age gave way to nuclear waste. That's me. See, I grew up in the 80s, morning in America. Ronald Reagan and Mr. Belvedere fresh in my door telling me that life was more than mere survival, that I may live the good life yet. When my time came, Homer Simpson, Peter Griffin, and Al Bundy were all lying in wait to convince me that I could raise a family in a two-story on the single income of a shoe salesman. They lied. And I cry. Not for myself as oncoming generation of iPad kids on Hulu and Netflix. We pick your poison, but it rots your mind just the same. See them at your face. It's sipping, job seeking, asking the net for deeper meaning. Who am I? Where do I belong? What use can I be in days such as these? Kids born with go-go gadgets, wired to networks, connected, direct as latest trends, surf the web in search of themselves. No different. For medieval serfs ring the bells of the Catholic Church, listen holy writ, holy script, holy this, since the golden rule of pharaohs and Caesars, Romulus and Remus, Akbar and Alexander, Xerxes and Hammurabi, since the days of scribes and the books of kings, since they from on high convinced us down below that we ever needed their code of law to tell us we were free.
Uh, I engaged in a discussion with my son years ago. I think he was still in grade school. And he was, for a discussion for Black History Month, he was given the task of, uh, doing a short biographical discussion on a famous Black person. Um, what's the name? This always happens. It must be age. I don't know. But just when I need to know the name of somebody, it escapes me. Well, there was a man in the 19th century a black man who led a slave revolt. And he's
Nat Turner?
part.
Nat Turner?
Yeah, Nat Turner. That's the one, Nat Turner. And I asked my son to get him to think about the discussion. I asked him if he, was he free? And I asked him to contemplate the question, philosophically, and I asked him to contemplate the question, empirically, practically. Your poem gets me to think about the importance of, the kind of thing that we read about as far as freedom is concerned, as far as liberation is concerned, when we know history and when we read Frantz Fanon. So I want to thank you for that. And I look forward to our conversation next week as we slowly make our way through chapter 25. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.